Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Berkley Center. For those of you who have not been here, the Berkley Center is 9 years old. It is a part of Georgetown University reporting to the president, very much a multidisciplinary effort looking at many different aspects of religion and public affairs. I'm Katherine Marshall. I've been here from the beginning, and I work on issues of religion and global development, which means pretty much everything. In other words, a very wide range of subjects. And we're very delighted to be here today in a partnership with the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies and Boston University also our partners, the CURA, which is the Center for the Understanding Culture, Religion, and World Affairs, okay, whose director, Bob Hefner, is sitting at the back. You are getting a treat this afternoon because this is the conclusion of a two-day conference whose topic is Religious Change and Gender Relations in Southeast Asia, What the Policy Community Needs to Know. And we have not all, by any means, of the participants in this conference will be giving you at least a brief summary, but also some thought-provoking ideas that have emerged from the conference here. The effort is part of a 3-year project that's supported by the Luce Foundation, which is looking at religion, a wide variety of issues in Southeast Asia. Several other members of the conference are also here, and just to give you an idea, you're not going to hear from Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia, though if anyone has specific questions about those countries, I'm sure that our colleagues will be happy to volunteer. What we have been discussing in these days is the religious transformation that's taking place in Southeast Asia. Is it a resurgence? Is it a transformation? What is the change, the nature of that change? And above all, the ways in which it intersects with changing gender roles, meaning primarily roles of women, but also the relationships between men and women. And implicitly in these discussions, we've been reflecting on how this compares with other world regions and some of the issues that preoccupy policymakers and policy observers in today's world with the changing roles of religious institutions, beliefs, and particularly, of course, the violent extremism, which is so much a focus these days. So with that, I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one, asking them a question. If they go beyond 7 minutes, they will, or 8 minutes, they'll be in serious trouble because we would like to have an exchange with you. But that's the instructions that they're under. So the first person is Siti Syamsiyatun, who's with the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. And what I hope she will talk about, I hope you can answer the question of what is the nature of the transformation of religious institutions in Indonesia, which has the world's largest Muslim populations, and how have women's visions and roles worked to change and transform religious institutions, and how does that make its way into public policy in Indonesia and possibly even beyond Indonesia and the region? Siti.
Thank you very much, Professor Katherine Marshall. As you may know, Indonesia, since the beginning of the independence, religion is everywhere in public space and in public life, and it's enshrined by the state, and I said it on the state philosophy and also on the constitution. So religion is always in the air. and how is it the transformation of religion and also the state development to the public policy. If we look at the history, religion endorsed many of the programmatic development of the state, most notably in education. So beginning from the education, women get access to the formal education, informal education, and now many women attain higher education, including in religious education or in Islamic education, in which for many centuries it's become like the domain of male scholars or ulama. So women doctors now we can claim on their own right to speak on religious interpretation, religious knowledge, to engage the debates on the public issues. So starting from that, women try to find strategies how to make awareness about the gender perspective, gender issues that has been absent in the mind of male scholars. This is because they are never experiencing becoming women, for instance. So the way we communicate with our male counterpart is not to make them as the culprit, as the what we call it, like the culprit suspect for everything, put it in the bag that you are, this is all your fault. We try to understand that you never been experiencing being a woman, so let's talk. So I would like to illustrate in the organization, one of the largest and outstanding long-lived organization in Indonesia, beginning from Muhammadiyah, and how these Muhammadiyah women try to talk with their male counterparts. And look at this, Muhammadiyah have hundreds of schools, hundreds of universities, hundreds of hospitals, and in those hospitals and those schools, men, women, girls, and boys. So how should we respond to the girls' question, to the women question on that? And then beginning the question, the conversation. And as you know, Islamic organization or Islamic minds is always shaped by scriptural imagination. So almost everything refer to what is the Quran said. So the interpretation of the scripture of Quran is very essential. So women entering to that kind of conversation on the reinterpretation of the scriptures of Quran, and also for the prophetic tradition, to try to find the significant, the relevance to our today's world. And then we find, for instance, that the first believer in Islam is woman, actually, Siti Khadijah, the wife of the Prophet. And the wife of the Prophet was known to be also a businesswoman, exported, imported, very rich businesswoman who also had together with the Prophet in their life. And the other wife of the Prophet that is known to be knowledgeable, independent, is Aisha. So Aisha is known to be a source of knowledge, where the companions of the Prophet sometimes asking her for issues related to family affairs, to women affairs. So this is the kind of knowledge that the male companion of the Prophet didn't know what's happening in the household of the Prophet. So beginning the conversation of the family affairs, how the Prophet relates to their wives, how the Prophet, taking care of the household, showing her affection, showing his affection to the wife, become an important issue for Muslim women to talk about the gender relation in our today's world. So from that matter, it is evident that in Muhammadiyah, there have been many concepts that is produced to give the guidance, more practical guidance for the Muslim life. For instance, in 1930s, there is a take on becoming women. In Indonesia, it is menjadi istri sejati, menjadi putri Islam sejati, becoming a true Muslim woman. So one of the characteristics of true Muslim women is they seek knowledge, they are faithful, they are independent, for instance. And then in the 1970s, there is a book also released on the question of whether Muslim women can take up leadership. And it is the Adabul Mar'ah fil Islam, that means the moral, something like morality, good moral for Muslim women, in which it is very clear that women can be leaders in almost all spheres, including at that time, during the 1970s, during the President Suharto era, that women can be a president. What is mentioned here that women cannot yet is women leading the Friday prayer congregations. So anything, it is allowable. And then from that conversation, women together with the other mass organization, NGO, they try to influence the government. So if you know, President Abdurrahman Wahid, for instance, with the support of many Islamic organizations, he endorsed the gender mainstreaming strategy in 2001, and then in 2002, the law on child protection is also enacted, and then in 2004, law on the elimination on domestic violence. Then after that, now in the conversation, law on gender equity and justice. So women start entering from the religious sphere and then start talking to become the pressing interest to the political party, then become the public policy.
Good.
So that is the highlight. Thank you.
Good. I think later we'll come back to some of the issues of backlash against the rights that many women have acquired. Let's move on to the Philippines. Eleanor Dionisio is with the John Carroll Institute of Church and Social Issues. And she has a fascinating story of law, tension, and society where the protagonists are the Catholic Church and women's organizations. So perhaps you can give us some insights from what's happening in the Philippines.
Thank you. Maybe I should start with the statement that the women's movement in the Philippines, at least the two main feminist organizations that were established in the 1980s, were actually, I could say that they were nursed at the bosom of the church. Many of the women who were part of these organizations came out of the social justice tradition of the church, and part of their feminist awakening came about because they were looking at issues of dignity, equality, and participation, and applying these to their own situation as women, both in Philippine society and in a church that is in which the hierarchy, the leadership, is exclusively male. So this women's movement was an ally of the church during the dictatorship, working on issues of social justice and democracy. Many of the documents of the church at that time actually reflect a growing positive view of the women's movement. But things began to kind of fall apart in the late 1980s, after the dictatorship had fallen and we had a post-authoritarian regime, when the church began to lobby against a comprehensive family planning program, which many of the members of the women's movement saw as part of women's rights, the right to control your own fertility. This led to a bitter battle that lasted almost a quarter of a century over the reproductive health law, or the RH law. The RH law was passed in 2012. But before that, another law was passed, which the church also bitterly opposed, the Magna Carta on women, of women. And this is a comprehensive bill for the promotion by the government of gender equality. I guess this is like the gender equality law that Dr. Syamsiyatun was talking about in Indonesia. And this is a law that was enacted in compliance with the UN CEDAW. The church opposed this law, or at least certain segments of the church opposed the law, because well, one of the things that they asked for was to strike the word gender out of every single provision of the law, because the church does not like the word gender, because it implies that, you know, sex is physical, but sex is biological, but gender is cultural, which means that the roles of men and women are interchangeable or constructed or relative in every society. And the church just does not like this, because they see the roles of men and women as essentially different. Women are in charge of the domestic sphere primarily. They can, and this is in some of the papal documents on women, they may participate equally with men in the public sphere, but without prejudice to their responsibilities to the domestic sphere, which are larger than those of men, greater than those of men, because women have a special relationship to children because of their biology, and this is all seen by the church as sacred truth. So any suggestion that women's and men's roles are socially constructed becomes a sensitive topic for the church. But the other reason that the church opposed this was because it was in compliance with the UN CEDAW, which the church, as many of you probably know, had problems with because of reproductive rights. So that the Magna Carta of Women took 10 years to enact from the time that it was first proposed as a bill. Now, I think that the church's opposition to the RH law has had costs to the church because of damage to its political credibility, but the costs to women have yet to be quantified. So we don't know how many teenage pregnancies, abortions, and maternal deaths could have been prevented if contraceptives had been made more accessible to women unprepared for pregnancy in the course of that 25-year period. And even with the passage of the RH law, militantly conservative Catholic opponents, especially those affiliated with Human Life International, can still slow or sabotage its implementation by working with local officials and bureaucrats to obstruct the distribution of contraceptives. And I think one tactic that the most militant are going to try is to try to get certain contraceptives labeled as abortifacient, which would then make them illegal under the Philippine Constitution. For instance, every medical student knows that the pill at a certain dosage becomes an abortifacient, so they're going to try to argue things that way. But I think that this is a minority. I think the majority of the bishops especially are moderate and understand that there are issues more important than contraception, especially since this Pope keep saying that. My impression from speaking with some of them is that they're ready to move on, to stop challenging the RH law, and instead, if they're going to do anything, to quietly promote the church's preferred method of fertility regulation, which is natural family planning. Do I still have time?
Well, I think that's the state of play right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, why don't we move on to Cambodia? Farina So is with the Sluk Reith Institute, and she is focused on a story that's not very well known, which is the Muslim communities in Cambodia and some of the changes that are taking place in that community. She's asking what kind of movement is involved, where does it come from, and what is the impact on the people and on the communities. So Farina.
Thank you. I would begin by telling you a story, my own story. A few years ago, the leader of Jamaat Tablighi, the new religious movement in Cambodia, came to me and asked me to join the movement. The reason is, he said to me, because I am highly educated woman, you know English, so it's important. Maybe you can encourage other women to join the movement. I didn't say anything. I just told him that, let me think about it, because I have to understand more about about the movement, the impact on women, and also on other Muslim and non-Muslim. So I participated in the movement, but not as a master or the one who was in a complete well, but just an aid to the host of the sermon. So it was very interesting because I learned a lot about living with the people who participated in the movement. So why this kind of movement took place in Cambodia? Cambodia is a Buddhist country. Muslim is the minority, comprising about 4% of the total population, so about 600,000 out of 14 million, 1/4 population. Muslim and also non-Muslim lived through genocide in 1975. So Muslim group was targeted during the Khmer Rouge genocide period. And after the regime, they wanted to redefine what is Muslim, what kind of Muslim identity should we take on, should we adopt. So there was no consensus among Muslim. So some people would look to Malay community or Malaysia, or to the Middle East, or to South Asia in order to reconstruct Muslim community in Cambodia. So at first, the community dominated by Malay influence. We call Malay influence Safi. But then in around 2000, another group of Muslim leaders felt that they don't quite fit well into this kind of religious or Muslim identity. They want something else, so that they look to what we call the Da'wah Jama'ah or Da'wah Tablighi. This kind of movement is quite different from other community group, because it focuses on the 6 main principle, which is different from the 5 pillars of Islam, which practiced by the moderate Muslim. So this one focuses more on the congregation, of course, salat, the 5-time prayer. So they focus more on increasing the connection or intimacy between Muslim, but less with non-Muslim. So, but then the good thing is they want to empower women to get involved in the movement, which is different from other group. So at the story I told earlier, that they want to reach out to women, especially highly educated women, in order to get other women involved and to lead their own group, because you cannot lead other group or male group except your own group. And they want to increase moral values, because they feel that moral value has been deteriorated, especially after the war and especially during globalization, the negative effect of globalization on women. You go to higher education and you challenge your family. You don't listen to your mom because you're going to stay longer. You don't want to get married, things like that, and a lot of things. So why don't we go back to Sunnah, to Prophet Muhammad saying, or way of life? So why it matter? Of course, even they try to empower women, to have women, to increase women roles in religious aspect or religious practice, but women would not have a voice in public life. They would not get education, proper education, and also good job, a lot of things in terms of what we call public life. So it can be one of the backlash. I'm not sure I'm the only target. Maybe not, because it also happened in other country, Bangladesh, and around the world, even in the United States. So this is something we need to think about, what kind of policy should be made, especially from whose perspective, from religious community, or from the state, or from NGO, civil society. So I think we can open up for discussion after this. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you. Let's move to Myanmar, Burma. And Juliane Schober, who's the director of the Center for Asian Research at Arizona State University. And she is very much focused on the fascinating, sometimes encouraging, but also disturbing developments that are taking place, particularly in relation to Buddhism in Myanmar. Can you give us some insights into what's happening and how you see this relating to the issues of gender?
Thank you for your introduction. Thank you for being here. Most of you probably think of Myanmar, or formerly Burma, as a Buddhist country, and so do most Burmese. In fact, to be Buddhist and to be Burmese was a slogan that was quite common both during the period of independence, but it's also been reinterpreted in a variety of different contexts since that time. And most recently, Myanmar has been undergoing a process of opening up and liberalization in a number of domains, and reforms have reached just about any sector of society, including the role, and have impinged upon the role of women in particular. And with it has been, I suppose, a certain kind of nervousness, a certain kind of anxiety of what it means to belong to this new state of Myanmar, and how to envision its future in a way that includes a number of different religious communities, not only Buddhists, who constitute the majority, but also Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and others, who are represented by a rather diverse ethnic range of groups. They constitute a minority vis-a-vis the Burmans, but nonetheless, there is a great deal of religious diversity in Myanmar. So the question is how to accommodate or how to envision a future for the country that finds a place for a number of different religious communities within that. And as is often the case, such processes don't necessarily go straight forward. Sometimes they entail 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or things are negotiated among a range of groups in society, and this is certainly the case in Myanmar today, where most recently a set of 4 laws have been proposed, all of which would have a direct impact on women regardless of their religious backgrounds. But primarily, I believe they were formulated to protect race and religion in Myanmar, which means the Buddhist religion and the religion of the majority of citizens in Myanmar. So this group has emerged, the Association to Protect Race and Religion in Myanmar, and they are proposing laws. They are at various stages of the legislative process. One concerns the control of population growth, particularly in rural areas, although some feel that it has been formulated especially to put limits on population growth among Muslim communities. And so this is the law that has now, I believe, passed the legislature and is awaiting signature from the president. That is the law to impose restrictions on the productive agency of women, particularly in rural areas. But this is not a law by itself. There are 3 other laws proposed that deal with, first of all, requiring governmental permission for individuals adopting a new kind of religious faith. And that matters, of course, especially at the moment of interfaith marriages, when, for example, if a Burmese woman were to marry a Muslim man, then most likely that would entail conversion of faith, and this is something where we see public anxiety articulated around. And so there are laws that or proposed laws that would require government permission for those kinds of conversions to take place, but also for interfaith marriages of this nature to take place. And so finally, the fourth law that is being proposed is to outlaw polygamous marriages. As I've said, the Association to Protect Race and Religion is perhaps a vocal organization that has a certain amount of grassroots support, but nonetheless, it's also, I believe, a debate that articulates certain kinds of anxieties about how this new reformed Myanmar will embrace a future that accommodates a number of different religious groups. And so I think that's what we see coming to the fore in this particular debate. It's a debate that draws on historical sources because similar issues have emerged during the colonial period in the 30s as well as in the 50s. And so in a way, this is a certain kind of iteration of anxieties about national and religious identity and the role of women within those contexts. But it is not the only voice in Myanmar today. There are other voices that very much advocate the right of women to speak for themselves, to control their reproductive agency, and to enact their individual rights of religious freedom, as well as the right to self-determination. Those groups include a number of civil groups that have become active in the public arena, and they also include international critics who have taken a position, particularly the UN, on these proposed laws as having implications for women's rights as well as human rights more broadly in Myanmar. And then finally, I'd like to point out that there are other kinds of movements underway in Myanmar. For example, a proposed party that will focus exclusively on the rights of women in public life, and even the proposal that 30% of elected representatives in Myanmar's government should be women. So the debate about the role of women in this new vision of Myanmar moving forward spans a broad perspective of voices that engage both a certain kind of anxiety about the place of the majority, as well as other kinds of visions for the future that are more inclusive of a variety of different groups, and perhaps envision more of a secular future for the country. So this is sort of the state of affairs of debate about women's rights and religion in Myanmar today.
And certainly a central part of the drama that we're seeing in the transition in Myanmar. Next, we're going to turn to Nancy Smith-Hefner, who's an anthropologist at Boston University, and ask if you can reflect on the gender dimensions or the gender developments that are associated with the Muslim resurgence, as I think it's fair to call it, in Indonesia.
Thank you, and thank you for attending. Just to repeat or to remind you, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country by population. About 88% of Indonesians identify as Muslims, and like so many other countries in the Muslim world, Indonesia has also undergone a resurgence of interest in more normative forms of Islam. Interestingly, in Indonesia, the Islamic resurgence is very closely associated with the growth of a new middle class. And this is a middle class that, unlike the earlier merchant-based middle class is actually an educated middle class. It's associated with education. The growth of the middle class has been rather rapid. In the late 1990s, estimates were placed the middle class at around 16 or perhaps 19%, and today it's closer to 60s, by some estimates even higher percentage than 60%, above 60%. The resurgence of interest in more normative forms of Islam is also related, as I said, to increases in levels of education as well as the growth of economic opportunities for young people. And Indonesian women, interestingly, are eagerly taking advantage of these educational and economic opportunities. And in recent years, they've even caught up with or even exceeded the achievements of men. World Bank statistics for 2012, for example, indicate that the ratio of Indonesian females to males in tertiary education had exceeded 103%. One result of women's educational involvements has been to put off marriage. And here we begin to see perhaps a little bit of the backlash or the response that Katherine was alluding to. There have been repeated moral public panics about premarital sex and the effects of, in fact, putting off marriage and the possibility of non-marriage for women as problematic. We see this again in statistics. Up until 1960, about 1/3 of all young Indonesian women were married by the age of 16. By the 1970s, only 10% were marrying by that age. In 1965, the mean age at marriage for females in Indonesia as a whole was 18.6. In 1971, it was 19.2. And by 1990, the figure had climbed to 21.6 years. And in Yogyakarta, where I work, the mean age of first marriage for females in the 1990s was 24.1. So we see this dramatic increase in the age of first marriage among women and the postponement of marriage. And as I said, there have been side effects to this postponement as well. Finally, Indonesian women are not only taking advantage of educational opportunities, but they're also eagerly taking advantage of employment opportunities. And what we see in Indonesia is a pattern that is quite different from that seen in some of the Middle Eastern countries, where we also see an increase in the percentage of women taking advantage of educational opportunities, but it's not necessarily translating into their movement into employment. For example, in comparison with the countries Jordan and Egypt, it's interesting to look again at World Bank statistics for 2013. Here we find the percentage of Indonesian women over the age of 15 participating in the labor force is 47.6%. That may not sound startling, but in fact, the Indonesian figures are particularly striking when we compare them to the comparable figures for Egypt and Jordan in terms of employment statistics for women over the age of 15. The Indonesian figure is close to 3 times the percentage of working women in Egypt, and nearly 4 times the percentage of working women over the age of 15 who are participating in the labor force in Jordan. So it's interesting to speculate on why we see these kinds of differences, and I'd like to propose a couple of possible reasons. The first is an obvious one, which is the relative availability of employment opportunities for women, which do exist in Indonesia. The second is the historically what's referred to as the relatively high status of Indonesian women who have long played a public role in farming, in marketing, in trading, and so forth. And the third, and perhaps the most important one, is the support of, or the general support of men. I don't want to say it's 100%, but certainly there's a strong support from men and also the families of working women who see that their contribution to their own family support, And this consensus that generally the idea that women can make a valuable and important investment in the futures of their family is fairly widely accepted. I think I'll leave it there because.
Good. By the way, just a warning to all of you that my plan is, after we hear from Bernie, to pass the mic along and ask you to imagine yourself with a very short elevator meeting with John Kerry and what you think he needs to know about what's happening with religion and gender in Southeast Asia, just in a couple of sentences. Okay, so last but by no means least, we come to Bernard Adeney-Risakotta, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who has a fascinating story that is an explanation for the complexities of what we see happening in Indonesia and to a degree in other countries in the region, the result of multicultural and complex gender justice issues. If you're very lucky, he will tell you a story as well. So over to you.
Okay, thank you. Indonesia, similar to the United States, has laws that guarantee gender justice. So men and women are equal before the law. Their rights are guaranteed. Similarly, religions are equal before the law. But as we know, when all are equal, some are often more equal than others. And so the question of, is there gender equality or gender justice in Indonesia, or is there religious and gender discrimination in Indonesia? It's a little bit like asking, is there racism or sexism in the United States? And the answer is obvious. It's obvious that there are big problems of discrimination, of injustice, of inequality. But it's made more complicated in Indonesia by the fact that it's such an extremely diverse country that people in all different parts, there's 17,000 islands, and all these different ethnic groups and religions, and they all have different traditions. And Indonesia does not see law as being an absolute universal that's the same for everybody. Indonesia has a long tradition of diversity and pluralist interpretations of law. So some people said that in Indonesia, law is not like you may or you may not do something. It's more like a suggestion. And you negotiate it. And you negotiate it between religious authority, between traditional authority, and between modern ideas and modern national law. But I think that a lot of what actually happens on the ground in terms of gender discrimination and religion is often connected to practices and imaginations. I've been racking my mind for good stories. I'm not sure I have any really good stories, but I think that one thing that has happened very recently has been the increasing practice of women taking authority in Indonesian life. We saw the director of the 3 University Consortium for Religious Studies, Ibu Syamsiyatun, is a woman. The rector of the the largest university in Indonesia, the rector is the president of the largest university in Indonesia, which is also the best university in the social sciences and humanities, is a woman now. The most popular minister in the cabinet of the current president is not only a woman, but a highly controversial woman who seems to be fearless in breaking stereotypes and conventions. She was actually a schoolmate of my wife, but she dropped out of university because of her opposition to the Suharto government and her political activism. Her name is Susi Pujiastuti, and she has sort of amazed Indonesian society by her boldness in taking action that most men would fear to take. Most people of any gender would fear to take. So one of the things that struck me when I first came to Indonesia was how powerful many Indonesian women are. It's not unusual to meet powerful women in Indonesian society. It's not all positive views. I asked my students at Muhammadiyah University whether they thought that men and women should be separated. They don't separate from each other in class, but whether they thought they should be separated. And they said yes, because women are so powerful that men will be too easily tempted. And so you have to keep the men and the women apart because men are too weak. So the images that people have of women in Indonesia are often very, very strong and very powerful. Now, the problem of diversity is a problem of negotiation. So how do you negotiate between the substantive values of the state? The state has certain values that it wants to promote. For example, monotheism, for example. Women's equality, for example. The substantive values of the state has to negotiate with the rights and the demands of different religious, economic, political, and cultural groups. So you have different groups that demand to be treated differently. Aceh is an example, maybe the most dramatic, where there is Sharia and there are strong restrictions put on women's behavior, clothing, activities. This is within the state of, within Indonesia, but there is a recognition that different areas can demand and implement different laws that are not the laws of the nation. So this, in combination with the idea of universal human rights, which is also a very strong, powerful idea in Indonesia, universal human rights, including the universal rights of women, has led to this kind of tension between religious values, cultural values, national law, and the negotiation between different groups in Indonesia to be able to rule themselves and implement their own values in society.
No story.
No story. Sort of half a story there, a couple of half stories.
He told some wonderful ones earlier today. But let's say you have a minute, and we'll start with you. A very brief moment with John Kerry, and he's been in meetings on violent extremism and the terrible things happening to women in various societies, particularly in the Middle East. What does he need to know? What does and by implication, of course, what should he do about it?
I thought I was going to have another 8 minutes of everybody else talking first. Okay. Mr. Kerry, I think you need to realize that in Southeast Asia, religion is one of the most powerful resources for development and for human rights. That religion is not primarily a problem. In particularly in Indonesia, Islam is not a problem. Islam is a resource. There are certainly problems within it, but it's a resource in which you have to take into account the deepest and most profound commitments of people's life in their commitment to God, that this has a profound impact on how they operate. So the important thing is not whether people are religious or whether they are Muslims, it's what kind of Muslims are they, what kind of religious people are they, is their religion a resource for humanization and for equality and justice, or is it something that is a source of destruction and conflict?
So a positive picture.
Positive picture
and
of
complex. Nancy.
Yes, well, first I'd ask for a photo with Kerry, but after that, I think I pick up on the same line, this idea that in Indonesia, Islam and the resurgence of interest in Islam has gone hand in hand with the rise of the middle class and with increases in education are all positive sorts of things. And in particular, I'd point out the ways that women have, in fact, been able to take advantage of these opportunities. I think that's probably where, yeah. So, and
Juliane.
to you, I'm sure you'd want a photo op, too.
I
Right.
do want a photo, yes. Beyond that, I have a wish list, I suppose, and that would be a suggestion to invest in education. Myanmar has a strong history of education, particularly in monastic schools, but also among Christian schools. We have a representative from the Myanmar Institute of Theology here. And education is something that will be a good investment. It's going to be well received on all parts of society. And it will also contribute to the imagination of the country's future in any direction, really. And women are certain to play an important role in determining that future. There are important public figures in Myanmar who are women, and there are a number of highly professional academics, both inside of Myanmar as well as outside, and education will be a wonderful investment at any level.
So Farina.
Yes, I think on the same line, education is very important. But in addition to that, I would tell him that looking or understanding religion is not only from security perspective, but also maybe pick up on yours to look into religion from kind of can contribute to social transformation. It's not something about, it's not always about bad things, but also a lot of good things that come into play. And in the case of Cambodia, of course, because of the genocide, and the community group really want to redefine their identity, and it's not something about threat, both for the non-Muslim community, but it's important to understand how Muslims also want to modernize and catch up with globalization. I would repeat the term religious globalization. This is a very important one.
I think I'm old-fashioned, so I'd want an autograph. And then I'd say, Mr. Kerry, you're a Catholic, you know what we have to deal with in the church, because this was an issue when you ran for president. But I think I would tell him also that if any investment is needed in empowering the women's movement in the Philippines, it's probably, or in empowering women in the Philippines, it would be maternal health and education. Are really good investments. But I would also tell him that the women's movement in the Philippines is actually quite capable of taking care of its own issues, and quite capable of dealing with the church. So I think that's pretty much what I would say.
Oh, I even frightened to imagine that meeting. However, one has been mentioned by Bernie, so thank you very much. And at the other side, I would like to acknowledge that as a public figure here, he has have to represent the interests of the American, and that is quite right, that sometimes he has something to do to enforce this interest over the others. And in that sense, we are learning from the failure and successes of our communication within the country and abroad, that I guess looking at our partner as a partner, equal partner, is most useful, rather than putting the other partner as inferior, that you have to take everything we detect, that what has been achieved by America, the advancement of material and knowledge is the best thing. But you know, in the world there are many people who think different way. So probably Mr. Kerry should talk about the same language when they are talking to, say, like Indonesian or Myanmar or the Philippines. That may be quite different from United States. Thank you.
Good. Well, we now have some time to hear your questions and comments. If you could please introduce yourself very briefly and give us some idea of who in the panel you'd like to ask a question to. So. No burning questions? Yes. And I'm going to have to repeat your question because of the mic situation. So just go ahead and I'll try to make sure I understand.
That's fine. I'm Lynn Clark from Berkley Center. My first question is directed to Dr. Juliane Schober. Thank you very much for your presentation on women, the impact of bills that are currently being discussed in Myanmar on women. I was wondering whether you could also touch on the perspective of Buddhism per se, as opposed to the laws that are being thought of in Parliament right now on women, and whether you think that's a positive thing or negative thing. And my second question is directed to Dr. Bernie Adeney-Risakotta. You mentioned earlier about how the decentralization that is taking place in Indonesia is leading to certain demands from certain provinces for different laws applicable to their own community of women. Have we seen, since the decentralization of Indonesia, a sort of regression in terms of women's rights, especially in these areas and in general? For example, I am thinking of the, I don't know whether this was passed, but there was suddenly a proposal or a ruling, a regulation wherein women policemen, or women who wanted to be policemen, had to pass virginity tests to become policewomen. So could you please touch on that? So 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the first question to Juliane, or 2 questions. The first one is, what is the impact of these laws that you've been discussing on women specifically, and then the questions of Buddhism more generally. What is happening vis-a-vis gender issues, women within Buddhism? Is that?
Just the second part, because I think she touched on the first part of the
Okay.
presentation, so just the second part.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Yes. Women play an important role in the practice of Buddhism in Myanmar. In traditional settings, they figure prominently as donors to religious causes, to monks who organize donation rituals that make merit for donors in the larger community. Women also figure prominently as female acolytes, as nuns by a shorthand, although their ordination is of a different kind than that of fully ordained monks. Nuns in Myanmar have become increasingly prominent over the last 20, 30 years. They have moved into education. They've adopted social causes, and some of them have been recognized as charismatic preachers and charismatic figures with a certain following. So the status of nuns in Burma is certainly rising and has been rising, as has been the number of women who are choosing that life for themselves. Beyond that, there are all kinds of interesting debates about women and enlightenment and things of that sort. And as in any religious traditions, there are all kinds of views on that. But certainly women are also prominent in meditation. There are many women who meditate and practice insight meditation, which has in and of itself become sort of a sign of modern religious practice. So I hope that that answers some of your question. Yeah.
Bernie, the questions addressed to you focus on the impact of the decentralization measures, particularly on women. The illustration was given of reports that candidates to be police, women are subject to virginity tests and other diversity, illustrations of diversity and potentially backlash that are associated with the current and important decentralization process.
Thank you. It's a, to answer your question would take a long time, but there is so much diversity that yes, it's the easy answer is yes. There are certain areas in which women's rights are under much greater threat than they ever were before, and with the authoritarian government of Suharto, the New Order government, then there was strong legislation from the top down that required much more uniformity. So now, since the fall of Suharto, there's been just this tremendous diversity of laws and regulations. Now, those who seek the Islamicization of Indonesia have not succeeded in getting province-wide or state-wide laws passed, except in the case of Aceh. So there have been laws passed locally called Perda, or like county-level laws that have imposed certain restrictions on women, on curfews at night, on dress, and so on. But there was I think during the war on terror of the Bush administration, there was a great sort of upsurge of radicalism in Indonesia that has since really been reduced. And the rapid increase in these kind of very conservative Muslim regulations has really stopped and has not been spreading. Now, the case of the police force is another problem. The police force is a deeply problematic institution now, as those who know Indonesia realize, and not only from the perspective of certain kinds of discriminatory laws in requiring physical examinations of women for their virginity, but also big problems of corruption and so on. Now, I haven't heard, maybe Bu Atun knows, there was a huge outcry in Indonesia over the virginity tests for the police force, and I think they got rid of them, right? I think, do you know if they got rid of the virginity tests? No. They didn't?
The Chief General of the Police, this is not requirement, but probably in, like some optimum individual tries to take advantage, but there is nothing on the books.
So they don't do that anymore. Okay, so the outcry against the virginity tests, I mean, it was headline news all over Indonesia, and there was a lot of protest at the popular level against it. I hadn't heard the final result, but as with the earlier point about laws against discrimination don't mean there's no discrimination. Just as in the States, laws against racism don't do away with racism. So discrimination against women in various ways at various levels happen all over Indonesia, whether or not there are laws that support them. But at least the protests against them are. But the other side of that is that there has been tremendous growth in women's movement all over Indonesia. So as Nancy was pointing out, the rapid increase in educational levels. Ibu Syamsiyatun was one of the first women to get a PhD in Islamic studies area, and she is the pioneer of a generation of new, very well-educated women who are rapidly taking positions of leadership, not only in Islam but also in other religious traditions as well. The Christian tradition is being transformed by the increase in highly educated women theologians in Indonesia.
Good. Are there other questions?
Can I actually
Yes.
say something about the police force and women that is interesting with regard to the laws and the attempts to implement more Islamic regulations? The police force actually was one of the later groups to allow the wearing of a uniform that involved Muslim, the Muslim headscarf, longer sleeves, and so on, in part because of regulations, they said, that had to do with the requirement for freedom of movement. But then once the regulation was put into place, it was very slow to be implemented. They said because they couldn't find the right cut of fabric, they couldn't get the right style that would be appropriate. So you see this interesting unevenness in terms of the implementation of various kinds of regulations, right? So when you hear something like, well, they're administering virginity tests, you can imagine that it's very spotty in terms of what's happening, and a lot of women actually thought this was just part of the physical that they were required to undergo to become a police officer, and didn't even realize that in fact it was a virginity test. That added further complication to this whole issue of what was going on.
Any other questions, including from any members of the panel for each other? Yes.
I'm Chris Deckard, Voice of America, Khmer service, news broadcasting to Cambodia. Just wanted to ask Farina, how would you describe the general health of the Muslim community in Cambodia? How is it doing 35, 40 years after the Khmer Rouge?
We have a question to Farina on Cambodia that turns on the general situation and health of the Muslim community.
Thank you very much. After the genocide in 1979, Muslim community tried to rebuild itself in many areas we call reconstruction process. So from seeking justice to rehabilitation to some kind of building the religious structure, like kind of reclaiming the identity. So for health issues, it has been understudied because not many research have been done on that area. And of course, a lot of Muslims live along Tonle Sap River or other like Mekong River, so along that area. And they have been exposed to all these kinds of, like disease because the lack of education, health education, and especially women, because women are more kind of exposed to this but the lack of education. So it's important that we need to think about health issues in the Muslim community. And last several years ago, I went to one of the Cham Muslim community called the Svai Kleng. So it is one of the traditional Cham community, and people don't have much understanding on what we call the restroom, the toilet. So they want to build a toilet in the community because most of the time they would go to the river, and then so it's affect the community health. So it's a very important one.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Tracy Apiado. I'm a freshman in the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. My question is directed to Ms. Eleanor Dionisio. And it's about Muslim Mindanao, especially with what's going on right now with the conflict in Muslim Mindanao. But my question is, the focus is very much on the conflict combat, but then not much on the issues with women and children. I guess, do you think that would shift, I guess the focus of the issues in Mindanao will shift to looking into the issues within the people, with the women and the children, instead of just the combat? And if it does, do you think, how do you think that will change, I guess, the country's focus on just the women and health issues? Because it seems right now it's very conflict-based from representation.
Yeah,
Just for the recording, the question turns on Muslim Mindanao, and the suggestion is that the focus there has been on the combat and on resolving the military, the tensions, but not very much on women and children. And how might that change? How might the church be involved?
Well, as you know, I'm sure, the government has worked out an agreement with one of the Muslim armed groups, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. They have drafted a bill, a proposed law called the Bangsamoro Basic Law, which I will just call the BBL, like everybody does. And I won't go into the whole, the crisis that happened like in January, because that's several soldiers were killed, and that kind of put the law into question. But the BBL was drafted with the consultation of Muslim women and several feminists, actually. The head of the OPAP, the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process, which was primarily responsible for negotiating that law, is a feminist. Her undersecretaries are feminist. And so they were very conscious that there should be a women's presence in the drafting of this law, in the crafting of this law, and that women should be consulted about it, Muslim women especially. There was a woman on the MILF side, Attorney Raisa Jajuri. She is also a feminist. So there has been a strong feminist presence in the crafting of the BBL. That doesn't necessarily mean that the welfare of women and children will be respected when the law is implemented. And there have been concerns voiced, I have heard by educated Muslim women about the Sharia law provisions of the BBL. But I think that in spite of that, there is support among educated Muslim women, or at least there are various ethnic groups, and it differs across ethnic groups. But there is support for the BBL among educated Muslim women, and perhaps Muslim women who are not so educated because they want peace so desperately. And so they are willing to deal with the gender equality issue later for the sake of peace now, because if there is war, then women are disprivileged anyway, there is no gender equality, and there are more tragic consequences for women. So there was something else I wanted to say, but did that answer your question? All right.
Are there any other questions? Well, if not, why don't we start with Siti, and let each of you, do you have sort of plans for the future on these topics, dreams? Do you have unanswered questions? Just a sort of very quick final comment before we wind up. We can go right along.
Yeah, there has been, as mentioned also by Ibu Nancy, that there has been some backlash on this women's movement in particular, and I guess one of the things is that sometimes we are speaking in different language, and as mentioned also by Pak Bernie, in Indonesia the language of religion, the religious language is much important, and sometimes the women's movement got failure because they use a more secular language that is not understood by those religious. So this is like more equal, including when we are talking to the American representatives, though, we have to talk with the humanitarian secular language. But then if we are talking to the Indonesian, then we have to talk in religious language. I think this is one of the things that we learn. And the other thing that we also learn from our failure is if we are making our partner as people who don't know anything, then we try to tell everything. I think this is not going to work. So our work with our male counterparts, if we always put men on the wrong side for everything, it's not going to work. So even for the outcries that is happening in Indonesia, for many unresolved problems or moral panic, sometimes the easiest way that men do is to blame women. This is not going to work. If men, you always blame us for everything, then it's not going to work. So I think this is what we need to learn. And maybe in the future, this kind of experiences can be tested again. Thank you.
Eleanor?
Okay, now I now remember the part of the question that I wasn't able to answer, the role of the Catholic Church. And in fact, this is one of the, well, we're very heartened. The Archbishop of Manila, Cardinal Tagle, has taken the initiative to head a committee to look into the peace process, and he's very supportive of the peace process, as several bishops are. And actually, one of the things that we discussed at a meeting with some old feminists shortly before I left was that this was one of the issues on which feminists could work with the church, because by and large the feminist movement in the Philippines supports the peace process, and this is one thing on which we are in agreement with the church, and it could help the church and the women's movement if they work together on this issue. I'm not sure how that's going to work, but certainly this is one issue on which there can be convergence.
I think investing in education is a very important one. Although we may face backlash as I'm facing now, but at least you can make a choice that you can consider what is right and wrong, whether you're gonna join or not. And you can also maybe succeed in public life and getting good job and educate other women or girls. But education here should be targeted toward both men and women. When we talk about gender, because when men also understand or have public or secular education, they can also be more open-minded. And the same thing with women, that they can have a more role in society and can make a choice. Thanks.
Thank you. I suppose I would like to return to our initial posing of themes for this conference, which was to consider the resurgence of religion in public life in Southeast Asia generally. And that is certainly true for Myanmar, where religious discourse has become more prominent in recent years. And I think that it will require all of us to pay attention to the nuancing of religious voices that we hear from the region, and to pay attention to the kinds of messages about social engagement that these voices bring with them.
I actually think that I would agree with that the discussion that we've been having the last couple of days has only raised more questions about interesting comparative observations that could be made cross-country observations with regard to the role of religion, the role of a religious resurgence or a resurgence of interest in more normative forms of religion across countries, and comparatively what this means for women. We've only begun to raise the questions, we haven't answered them. And one that just struck me, even as I heard people giving their very short little spiels just now, is how easily Eleanor talks about feminists and Catholic feminists, and how this is obviously part of the discourse that is a very easy discourse within the Filipino context, and it's not as easy, I think, within the Indonesian context, for the reasons that Bu Siti said, having to sort of craft your comments to your audience, and if it's a religious audience, Muslim and feminists, there are some more problematic relationships there. So that'd be something else that would be interesting to look at across the country examples.
I'd like to reiterate or emphasize the interaction between practices at the local level and laws at the national level, and how they influence each other. I think one of the most striking from a gender perspective laws that was passed at the national level was the law in Indonesia requiring that at least 30% of all candidates for public office in Indonesia have to be women. And this has had an impact on all kinds of institutions, because even the most conservative Muslim organizations, they have to find 30% of their candidates for public office at local levels and at national levels have to be women now. And that has, it's had an impact on ICRS, because one of our students was recruited to become a candidate for the national legislature, and she won in the election. So now we're trying to see if we can get her to fit in a dissertation between passing legislation in Jakarta. But that's at national level. That's the result of lobbying by feminists, whether they call themselves that or not, feminist women's organizations all over Indonesia to pass a national law of that sort. I was also struck by a story from a judge in Banjarmasin. Banjarmasin has the highest incidence of child marriages and the lowest incidence of education for women, and those two things are very related to each other, in the country, in spite of having one of the highest incomes in all of Indonesia, mainly from coal. But anyway, this judge said that women are only allowed to be married if they are less than 16 with the permission of a judge. And he said, I would normally never give permission for a girl to be married who's less than 16 years old, but often I give permission because the family comes to me and says, the girl is already pregnant from a much older man. And so rather than cause a huge family community conflict by accusing a man of statutory rape, which he could do, he rather would give permission for the marriage in order to maintain harmony in the society. So, but this kind of situation has led to a movement now where there is a movement to, I think, a proposed law to raise the marriage age for girls from 16 up to 19, so it's the same with men. That's another case where a law could have a big impact on what are the actual practices. There is strong resistance to revising the marriage law to do away with polygamy. So polygamy, or marriage of up to 4 women for men, is legal and is seen as integral to Islamic law. However, in Indonesia, there is a huge movement against polygamy, even among very conservative, literalist Muslims. And one example of that is that one very, very famous preacher, Gin, was married a second wife, and he immediately, almost overnight, lost a whole media empire because he was so popular, and then his popularity, I suppose he was most popular with young women, and when he married a second wife, his popularity went down the tubes, and he's can maybe get midnight TV now, but sometimes the practices are much better than the laws. So the laws don't always influence everything because often practices overrule the laws. And I think in Indonesia, only 1% of marriages are polygamous. So it's a very, very low incidence of polygamy, even though the law allows it.
Well, thank you. We've come to the end of a fascinating discussion. I think you've had a vision of both the diversity of the issues and the diversity of approaches from a quite multidisciplinary group focusing on this fascinating region of the world. I think the themes of diversity, the centrality of religion, and really the changing discourse about religion are important themes that we've heard in very different ways over the last couple of days. So thanks to all of you for coming. This will be on the website, the video of this event, if you want to watch it again. And especially thank you to all of you, as well as to your silent colleagues who have been with us for the last couple of days. Good night.